All right, we're about to get started, everyone. Keynote speaker, Professor Costas Miguel, colleagues, students, conference attendees, friends all, good morning and welcome to WECON 2026. Last week, Dr. William Maloney, the World Bank's chief economist for the Latin America and the Caribbean, spoke at a department seminar attended by colleagues and graduate students. During his presentation, he was kind enough to give the students advice about a possible career at the World Bank. One of the things he advised them to do is to stay curious. That got me thinking about how much of research is about curiosity. Researchers are naturally inquisitive people who are always asking questions, always interrogating, always trying to find solutions. When I was in graduate school, I had a trade theory lecturer who, as he taught us the different trade models, would regularly make statements like, "I wonder what would happen if I changed this, or if we made this assumption instead." As a good student, I would always studiously make note of these questions he would ask, often under his breath as if he was talking to himself, and sure enough, they would always end up on the exam. As a tip for the students, right? The world we live in today is rapidly evolving. Changes often appear to be moving at the speed of light. Even the way we communicate today is vastly different from the way we did 20 or 30 years ago. The prevalence of social media such as Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok epitomizes these communication changes, and advancements in AI tools such as ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, Bard, etc. exemplify the pace at which technology is moving. These changes provide vast opportunities for researchers to exercise their curiosity. Some argue that the forces of social media and AI are structural transformations that are reshaping the very foundations of knowledge creation. Social media provides a vast repository of data. This data can be used to study things such as preferences, market dynamics, consumer confidence, political polarization, etc. Of course, the use of this type of data also presents challenges such as representativeness issues, algorithmic bias, and ethical and privacy issues pertaining to the use of personal information. There are also methodological issues surrounding whether this digital data truly reflects fundamentals or if it's just amplifying noise. If we do decide to make use of this digital data, AI can help us analyze it. Machine learning in particular is a powerful tool that is revolutionizing how predictions are made. Models powered by AI can uncover patterns in financial markets, supply chains, and labor dynamics that were previously invisible. The seemingly unstoppable rise of AI also raises the question of how universities can encourage their students to view it as a research tool rather than as a substitute for original work. But AI itself is not just a tool. It can also be a subject of inquiry. Many questions still abound about its impact on productivity, inequality, the future of work, and natural intelligence, among others. We probably won't answer these questions in the next 2 days. But if you check your program, you'll see that we will be exploring a number of other thought-provoking, provocative, and intriguing issues. We'll start with a keynote presentation on the effect of education policy on crime and intergenerational perspective by Professor Costas Miguel, the Douglas A. Warner III Professor of Economics at Yale University. After which, we'll take a 20-minute break, and then we'll move into concurrent panels on banking and finance and climate and the economy. Our lunch break will be from 1 to 2, and the panels continue in the afternoon up until around 3:30. We start at 8:50 sharp tomorrow morning with concurrent panels on labor and education and governance and economic behavior commencing at 9, and the morning session ends at noon. Then we'll wrap up WECON 2026 with a climate change symposium that is being held in collaboration with the Climate Studies group here at Mona. The symposium, entitled Estimating and Financing the True Costs of Climate Change to Small Island Developing States, will feature a keynote presentation from Dr. Laura Alfaro, Chief Economist and Economic Counselor at the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as presentations from some specially invited experts in the field. Don't worry, we got the top climate specialists from Jamaica and around the world to be here at the symposium tomorrow, so make sure you don't miss that, right? After which, we're going to end with a bang. Backed by popular demand is the closing conference dinner. I know you guys have missed it, those who come every year. I know you look forward to that opportunity to, socialize and network. So we're going to end with a cocktail party tomorrow following the symposium. As you can see, you should anticipate compelling and stimulating discourse over the next 2 days as we engage in meaningful dialogue, share research, and identify actionable strategies for sustainable economic resilience. Let's challenge assumptions and imagine together the future of economic inquiry in a digital age. I now invite Ms. Lashawna Colquhoun, the Bank of Jamaica G. Arthur Brown Scholar and one of our top students in the master's program, to introduce our first keynote speaker.
Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for WECON 2026. We are extremely honored to welcome a scholar whose work has made significant contributions to economics, Professor Costas Meguiar, one of the foremost economists of our time. Professor Meguiar's contributions are both broad and profound. He has served as co-editor of Econometrica and joint managing editor of the Economic Journal. His research has been published extensively in the field's most influential journals, with his contributions earning him numerous accolades. He has been elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as a fellow of the Econometric Society, the British Academy, and the Society of Labor Economists. He was also awarded the Bodosakis Foundation Prize in 1997 and the prestigious Ragnar Frisk Medal in 2000. Earlier in his career, Professor Meguiar had a long and influential tenure at University College London, where he became a full professor and served as head of the Department of Economics. He later held several visiting positions at globally top-ranked institutions, including Stanford University and the University of Chicago. Beyond these roles, he continues to maintain active collaborations with leading research institutions worldwide. Currently, Professor Meguiar serves as the Douglas A. Warner III Professor of Economics at Yale University. Throughout his career, his research has addressed some of the most pressing issues in economics, including labor markets, public policy, human capital, and early childhood development. His work on early childhood interventions is especially impactful in informing policies that can improve outcomes across generations. Today, we are fortunate to have him share his expertise with us. He will speak on the effects of education policy on crime and intergenerational perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Costas Meguiar.
Oh, there you go. Thanks very much. So this one. Thanks. Well, thanks very much for the extremely flattering Yes. And I'd like to say that, well, this is not my first time in Jamaica, and a lot of the work I'm doing these days has its roots in Jamaica, and actually started here, because I do not know if you are aware of Sally Grantham McGregor, who is a professor, well, now in her late 80s. She basically founded the Child Development Group here with Sue Walker, and now I'm still working with people that are based here, like Taja Wilson, who just graduated her PhD, and a professor at Wales, but who basically did her PhD here, Helen Baker Henningham. And we're all still running experiments around the world, mainly at the moment in Africa. But we owe a huge intellectual debt to the group here. Did I mention Sue Walker as well, who was leading the group and just retired? So I'm really delighted to be here, although this is not the Child Development Group, but it's all linked in one, because it's all about human capital. And today we are going to talk about human capital. And in some sense, this work about education and its effects, its long-run effects, is intimately linked with all policies that raise educational and learning outcomes, right? Which is, of course, the central issue. In this time, and always, but in this time in particular, education is going to be should be center stage for any policy. And Patrice already mentioned AI, and what's going to survive out of AI are the thinking skills and the critical skills, right? And not the mechanical stuff, right? And that requires high levels of education and achievement. I think that's beyond doubt. So thanks, Jamaica, for the intellectual background to a lot of this work. And now I'll start talking about this. This is a paper that we've been working on for some years now, and it's joined with Ulrika Arscho and Morten Palme and Marieke Schnabel. And although the data comes from Sweden, I think the relevance of both the question and the result are kind of really international. So the sort of question we're asking here is the following. So there's been tons of work about what does education do, right, in the generation that let's say receives increased education. And there's been work on the causal impact of increasing education on things like earnings, of course, going back to Becker and Mincer and all that, but later on health and on crime. And there is now ample evidence that increasing somebody's education improves all these outcomes. In other words, education is not just something policy. Are we going to create a chain reaction down the generations such that the effects will be effectively socially permanent? That's the kind of thing we're asking here, although of course we're focusing on particularly on crime. But in looking at crime, we'll be looking at the various mechanisms that lead to the reduction of crime, and consequently we will be looking at other outcomes as well. And what we'll be showing is that even a relatively small improvement in education can reverberate down the generations, improving outcomes in the next generation. And I'll try and talk a little bit about the mechanisms that lead to this. So, So, of course, why is this relevant? Well, to state the obvious, if education policy has intergenerational effects, social returns are substantially larger than direct effects alone, and consequently investments in education, much higher investments in education are justified just by the simple cost-benefit ratio, right? So you're not only talking about, say, 7 or 8% increase in earnings per year of education, but you're talking about a reduction in crime with all the social consequences that this will have. You're talking about improvements in health, which of course make people's life better and economize in fiscal resources, and so on, right? So now what do we know here? There are a lot of, there quite a lot of work on intergenerational transmission. So there's some work on income shocks. So what happens if parents end up having more money? Do kids benefit? The answer is typically yes. Although the results there are mixed, some studies show that cash transfers do not reduce intergenerational crime. Other studies show that they might reduce them. The effects are kind of a bit on the edge. And that's quite important, actually. Oh, yeah, thanks. That's important because it links up to all this other work on child development. And it shows it's not just about money, it's also about, if you like, parenting practices and home environments and so on, right, which is really fundamentally about education and knowledge. So, okay. Okay, so this is a long literature. If you want to study it, you can, you can look at the paper. There are all the references there. Just very quickly, on international effects of policies, we have the work by Heckman et al., right, and then the work by Grantham McGregor, Powell, Sue Walker. That's the Jamaica experiment, and its later follow-up by Heckman, Gertler, Grantham McGregor, etc., which showed very long-run effects of things like parenting interventions on earnings of the child generation. Then we have work by Karin Moretti, paper I did some time ago with Pedro Carneiro and Matias Pari on the effects of educating mothers and so on. So basically, there is this kind of evidence showing that better educated mothers lead to children with better outcomes. Now, let me talk a bit about the setting. The opportunity to study this in a causal fashion comes from the fact that post-war in Sweden there was a massive education reform. Now, because the reform was considered quite radical, I'll tell you about the reform. They decided not to implement it all at once, but they allowed the various municipalities in Sweden to adopt the reform on a rolling basis. So Sweden has about 1,000 municipalities. So the rollout of the reform took place from 1949 to about 1962. And after 1962, it became permanent. Right? Well, basically, it was adopted nationally. Now, the reform is not particularly exotic. It's kind of quite mainstream relative to what happened in many other countries. So, for example, they increased compulsory schooling by 1 to 2 years. I'm saying 1 to 2 years because in rural Sweden, you could leave school earlier than you could in urban Sweden. So in many places around Sweden, compulsory schooling went up by 2 years, and in others by 1. But they didn't do only that. They abolished the tracking. In Sweden, it used to be the case that at 12 you'd sit an exam, and if you passed the exam, you'd go to the academic track. If you failed the exam, you'd go to a kind of a more vocational it was really kind of a low rate thing. It's a bit like, you know, if you're at all familiar with the British system, you know, the creation of comprehensive schools and the abolition of the 11+. If this existed in Jamaica, I don't know. It may have been because I guess quite strongly related to Britain. So they abolished all that. The effect of this was to increase earnings and education, particularly for people from lower SES backgrounds. Why that? Well, because the people in the higher SES backgrounds were already doing much more schooling, so the reform didn't really bite for them. Okay, so now Sweden has the first advantage of Sweden. You know, economists, as you know, we're all very opportunistic, right? We go where the data is and where the natural experiments are. So here you've got this massive national natural experiment. It's staggered. What you have is this beautiful contrast, because you've got people, say, born in the same cohort, let's say in 1959, depending on which municipality they are either in the new system or the old system, and at the same time, one municipality is in the old system, the other is in the new system, so you've got these two-way contrasts. That's one advantage. The other huge advantage about Sweden is that it's really a big brother state. The moment you're born, you get this number, right? It's like a national insurance, social security number, however you want to call it, right? And everything you do is associated with that number. You go to school and you pass an exam, that's recorded. You go to the doctor and you get a prescription for headache, that's in the system, right? So we know everything, right? You commit a crime or you're arrested, we know that. You're convicted, we know that. Right? But not only that, we can link the generations as well. We can link in the grandparents and the parents and the children, and we can have the whole generational sequence. So obviously, and of course we can look at. It goes without saying, we can look at all tax returns and get their income. Right, and you should also realize there's very little informality in Sweden. So basically, the income you get from the tax returns is actually their income, right? So you can construct a very, very rich data set. I mean, of course, you know, they don't take it lightly. There are very, very strict controls on confidentiality. And you can only work there locally on the local servers. Everything is anonymized and so on. So, you know, they're very, very serious about that. So you can't identify people. Okay, so that's the broader context. So let me just give you the main results. I guess I won't treat it like a novel where you have to wait till the last page to find who done it. So. But hopefully you will pay attention to the rest of the speech. So basically, the reform induced conviction rates for sons of treated fathers, right, to decline by 0.8 percentage points. And that's going to be very, very significant. So about 3.4% of crime just goes away, just from that. Now, I'll give you the magnitudes to calibrate it with respect to what the reform did to the parent generation in a little while. An interesting thing there is that mother's reform exposure didn't have any effect, and I'll show you why later, because it didn't affect mothers that much, right? Effectively, that's because, you know, mothers were at a higher level anyway, so the reform doesn't really bite as much there. But I will show that a little bit more in detail. The other thing, of course, is it doesn't affect girls at all. And that's because girls don't commit crimes, or it's a really very, very much lower crime rate than men, right? So you're not going to have an effect. Okay. Okay, so I'll leave the rest for later. Okay, so the kind of framework you need to think about is the Becker and Tomes framework, modified for parental quality. Let me explain what I mean there. Okay, so. Yeah, so the Becker and Thoms intergenerational framework is one that justifies, explains how human capital is transmitted across generations. In the simple Becker and Thoms model, the only thing that matters is income, right? So parents have, let's say, a particular level of income. They are altruistically linked to their kids. They like their kids. So they trade off their own consumption with investment in the next generation, right? And that leads to a particular level of human capital transmission. Human capital is transmitted in the following way. High human capital parents have more earnings. More earnings leads to a greater willingness to invest on kids because it's a normal good. It's just, in some sense, standard price theory, and consequently, kids have higher human capital, and all the good things that come out of that. Now, that model is, of course, extremely influential, but it's not complete. So, in some sense, if we take the idea from Heckman's idea, which actually, as I said again, links exactly to the early childhood development thing here. There's another element in the model that's missing, and that is the, quote, quality of the parent. In other words, the particular dollar investment by a low education parent has lower value than the dollar investment by a higher education parent. In other words, there's a complementarity between the education of the, let's say, the father or the father and the mother, and the outcomes of the child. So that introduces a new channel, an additional channel in the intergenerational transmission. While the first channel is directly the monetary channel, so human capital, more money, more better outcomes for the child. The other outcome here is human capital, better ability to invest in kids, more effectiveness in investing in kids, and consequently better outcomes for the kids. Right? That's basically been the heart of this literature here. Oops! One day I will learn how to use this. It kind of jumps around a little bit. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the reform. I told you a little bit about it already, but now I'll go through it in a slightly more detail. So in the pre-reform system, there was the common school, called Volksskolan, up to grade 6. And then you would be tracked into basic school for either 1 to 2 more years, or junior secondary school, which is an extra 3 years, right? So on the left, these are the kids who kind of failed the 11 plus. On the right, it's kids who who going through the academic track, right? And after that, you could go, you continue in academic school for another 3 years, but these guys would just would have no path to further education, really. In the post-reform system, which was proposed in 1948, there would be 9 years of comprehensive schooling with no tracking up to that point, right? That's the schooling that we are all used to now, but it didn't used to be like that, right? And then you'd have a national unified curriculum, so everybody was taught the same stuff, right? Which of course meant to equalize the opportunities across regions and socioeconomic classes. And so this meant that compulsory schooling increased to 1 to 2 years, basically. The implementation was gradual across these 1,055 municipalities. So that kind of gives us the quasi-experimental variation. At any point in time, we have a contrast between cohorts and between municipalities. And now, of course, this is not a randomized experiment, so there are some differences. So let me... Sorry?
Which slide do you want to be on? Yeah. Oh, the camera that manually for you.
It kind of is a bit random what it does.
Where do you want to be? Which slide?
I would love to be on the, there, I managed. Okay. So, well, perhaps this random reallocation of the slides might be an improvement over mine. But anyway, so you can see the gradual implementation. The blue line here is the proportion of municipalities that have adopted it any 1 year. Right, so you start in, well, there was some kind of early pilots, but we really start in 1948. Right, so so you can see the reform creeping up in the entire Sweden. Now we're going to try and go to slide 12. No, it went to 10. 11. Nope. Oops. 13. Okay, so this slide here, what it shows you is the fact that the reform implementation was not random. So you can see there, for example, that if you take all municipalities, the early adopters were the ones that had a higher income and higher municipal taxes. What does that signal? First of all, obviously signals the fact that the early adopters were actually wealthier municipalities and more liberal. The more liberal is kind of captured here by the fact that they have a higher local tax rate, which is used for public services. So it's not random. So we will need a kind of a difference in differences framework in order to be able to use this, right? So now let's see. No. Okay, well that's a useful slide, which we skipped. So what did the reform do to the parent generation? Just to give, I'm going to come back to this later, but it increased men's education by about 0.2 of a year, 0.174 of a year. Okay, so now it's a, as I said, the reform did not only work through the education, direct increasing education channel, education years, but also changed quality of education. But this number is useful to be able to calibrate in your mind how big the effects are. In other words, we're going to increase. So if you, in other words, if you want to have a kind of a ballpark estimate in your mind, you can think of, okay, I've increased education by a fifth of a year, right? What does that give me, right? And it gives me, as I said before, a 3.5% decline in crime in the next generation. So if you divide one by the other, you kind of get an idea of the magnitude. Right? Although I don't quite. So that number is important because it's not enough to just say, oh, there was an education reform. You want to kind of figure out what this reform did. Now, let me try and go on the. No, we did that. Okay. So the data we have: all individuals born in Sweden between 1944 and 1955. These are the parent generation. Okay. Now we have all their conviction records. We have the parental conviction records from 1973, that's when they started, which means that we have the cohorts 1952 to 1955 for parental crime analysis. We observe them. We observe these cohorts from the age of 18 to the age of 58. And the conviction rate for this generation is 34%. Now, that includes traffic crimes that are serious enough to land you in court, but not just citations in the street. But it's a surprisingly high number, right? I'm telling you that you're having, in this generation, 34% of men have a conviction of some kind in court. You'd probably think that's quite high for a country like Sweden, but that just tells you what preconceptions, that preconception can be misleading. Now, for the child generation, we take the children of the entire parent generation. We have their crime records from the age of 15 to the age of 29. That's a very important window because almost all crimes are committed by people in that age group. Okay, so it's basically younger people that commit crimes. It then just drops out. In this generation, 24% of men were convicted by age of 29. Right? And now, the treatment, and I'm going to come back to this, is whether the parent was assigned to the reform. Indeed, we're going to distinguish as to whether the father or the mother was assigned to the reform, not both. For the simple reason that if a father is assigned to the reform, right, then one of the outcomes is who they marry, and they might marry outside the municipality. So that's an endogenous variable. Now, this is the crime rate by age for the parent generation for two cohorts. What you see here, and remember this for the next slide, is two things. First of all, you see a decline in crime in conviction rates by age. So basically, the big peak is, as I said, before the age of 30, and then it kind of eventually declines to almost nothing. But the other thing you see is that the red and the blue line, which are two different cohorts, are on top of each other, which is showing you there's not been much of a decline in crime in that period. In other words, whether you are in the 45 to 50 cohort or the 51 to 55 cohort, the crime rate is more or less the same. Now, this is the same thing, but for the child generation. You see two things here. First of all, you see that the overall crime rate is just lower. And secondly, you see a steep, if you go from the top to the bottom, the blue line is the older cohort. The red is the kind of next one, and so on. If you go down there, you can see a very large decline in crime. This reflects a phenomenon we've seen in many, many countries, certainly in Sweden, in the US, in the UK. There's been a secular and rapid decline in crime across over time, right? So of course, the different diffs strategy will have to disentangle this, right? But it's kind of interesting and nice and optimistic that the crime rates in our time are much, much lower than they used to be. Right. And again, you see the same decline across age. And of course, the big decline in crime rates is among the younger people, because that's where crime is, really. Okay, good. Yes. Sir.
Oh, okay. All right. All right, no.
So you can see in the parent generation. Is this live? Yes. In the parent generation, you can see your 34% there for men, right? And you can see the 9% for women. Okay, so 9% of women have been convicted, 34% of men. In the child generation, 24% and 8%. Okay? Now, the rest on the right is conditional on conviction. What percentage is each category? They are overlapping. So they're not mutually exclusive. You can be convicted for traffic and fraud. Okay, so they don't add up to 100. Okay, but indeed, you see that approximately half of the convictions in the child generation, and nearly 60% in the parent generation is traffic. But you've got, 15% of violent, 21% property, 18% fraud, 17% drugs, 33% other. Kind of, quite a lot. Right. So that's the picture. The proportions, they kind of changed in the generation. So we'll be looking at impacts broken down by type of crime. So here we are. Here's a bit of descriptive stuff on the impact of education on crime. This is not causal. So first of all, you can see that a year of education reduces in the parent generation crime by 2.5 percentage points. All right, so so that's a huge correlation, right? So of course we'll be looking for causal impacts here. And if you look at the child generation, you can see that the combination of mothers and fathers' education reduces crime by more or less equal amounts. Prison, of course, as well. And for daughters, it kind of doesn't matter that much, but there's not that much crime to reduce. Now, this is the intergenerational persistence. So this is, the previous one was own education. Now this is intergenerational persistence. So this says that 1 year of fathers, confused. If the father was convicted, that raises the conviction rate of the child. That's again correlational. If the mother's convicted, that's equally bad for the son. For the daughter, again, you get these impacts where they are smaller. Okay, so this shows you that there's let's call it crime families. If the parents commit crimes, the children tend to commit crimes. But we're not saying this is causal at this point. Okay, so let's try and go through a little bit of a theoretical framework here to remember that we're economists. So we have the following channels. We have the human capital channel. What's that? Now, we have the reform. The reform is supposed to raise parental human capital. We're hypothesizing that. That raises investments in children because parents are wealthier. That raises the human capital of the child. That reduces child human capital. I will have to justify that. That's not obvious necessarily. And that's basically Becker and Tomes and Cunha Heckman and Schenach. Then we posit another channel, a direct impact, which we call the role model channel. right? So, in other words, what happens at home, kids copy, right? So the idea is that the education reform reduces father's crime, which it does. That has a direct influence on child behavior, right? And that reduces crime over and above the fact that the, given human capital, in other words, here, given child human capital. So let's think of it. Now I'm going to kind of outline a little toy model to justify all this. And I'm going to do it by backwards induction. So first of all, I'm going to argue that raising the human capital of a child reduces their tendency to commit crimes. And then I'm going to argue that how raising the human capital of the father will create the conditions for raising the human capital of the child. It's not very complex. So let's take the child utility. So the child can engage in lawful activities, and they will earn money out of that, and general utility, and that's going to be, let's denote that by VH, right? And then alternatively they could commit crimes. Now if they commit crimes, they're either caught or not caught. If they are not caught, what do they make? They make money out of their human capital, but slightly less, because they devote some time to crime. But then they also earn a return from crime. Okay, the kind of the laptops and the phones that are stolen are here, right? If they are caught, then of course they don't get the returns to crime, and they get a punishment, right? So that's their expected utility, and that gives you a probability of committing a crime. So we would like to know whether the derivative of this probability with respect to human capital is actually negative, because it can be that going to school and being well educated makes you a more capable criminal, right? So you don't get caught so easily. So it's not totally obvious, right? I think it is, but so. There's one important element here, which is that part of this decision is a kind of psychic cost to crime. So here's if you analyze this, what you're going to get is from the opportunity cost, a high lawful returns makes crime less attractive. Why? Because if you're going to earn a lot by working, you don't want to give up this work to go off and steal somebody's mobile phone, right? Because your time is too valuable. So that's an opportunity cost argument. Then there's the detection, right? If the probability of being caught is actually higher as your human capital goes up, basically more skilled individuals face higher expected punishment. And on top of that, if the marginal disutility of crime is large enough, that includes both the punishment that the state will impose on you, but also the psychic cost of committing a crime, then under these conditions, under these three conditions, you can show that the increase in human capital of the child will reduce the proportion of people committing crimes. Okay, so you have to align some things there, but all these are kind of relatively weak assumptions. But you could make more exotic assumptions under which this result would not be necessarily the case. Now, what happens with parents? This is basically the modified Becker-Tomes model. So parents have a particular utility function here, and that depends on their consumption. And they care about their kids, that's the altruistic parameter, and that's the child welfare. And that's the human capital of the child. Now, how is human capital produced? It's produced by parental investments, but the productivity of parental investments depends on parental human capital. So this is the extra element that's not in the Becker and Tomes model that Heckman, Cunha, and Schenach introduced. Right. And they have a budget. They can spend their resources, which depends on their human capital, on either their own consumption or investments in their children. Right? And the more they invest in the higher their human capital, the higher for everything else given, the higher their resources. That's the return to education. Oops. Okay, so basically there's an income effect. The higher the parental human capital, the more the resources, right? The higher the investments. That's the Becker and Tomes result. There's a productivity of child investments effect. The higher the human capital of the parent, the more effective their investments are in their children. And if you put these together, higher human capital of parents implies that more investments in children. More investments in children implies more human capital. We go back to the previous slide. More human capital for the child implies, under certain conditions, lower crime. That's the, so in a summary, okay, so it's one step backwards, two steps forwards, this, the clicker, but I'm getting the better of it. So basically, just to summarize, the reform has a direct effect, which is through parental human capital, right? And that increases income of the parents and increases their productivity in investing in kids. They increase their investments in children. That increases child human capital, and that reduces the probability of crime. So the key insight here is that the reform works both through the resource channel, right, and the productivity channel. This is why education reforms may reduce child crime even when pure income transfers do not. Okay, so that's the important point here, because there's been analysis of pure income transfers, and the question, does a pure income transfer, just giving money to the poor, have positive intergenerational effects? And these 2 or 3 slides are arguing maybe. Right? Because it's not only, you don't have, but the more important channel might be basically the direct human capital channel. Let me put it to you like this. You have 2 people, you have 3 people. One does not, say, complete high school. The other 2 complete college. One becomes a banker and earns $500,000 a year, and the other becomes a professor and earns $50,000 a year. My contention is that the professor and the banker are basically going to have similar quality kids, right? It's in other words, that the education channel is a primary channel for child investments and so on. Right, because it is the quality of parenting that matters, and the knowledge in many things, not the infinite amount of resources. You don't need Louis Vuitton suitcases to raise children in a proper way. So what I'm trying to say in a slightly joking fashion is here that we shouldn't underestimate how important the channel through education and human capital is beyond the channel of pure resources. Right. And let me give you another little example. One of the key things we learn in the child development literature is that talking to children and engaging with them is what improves cognitive development. That's a very, very cheap thing to do, but it doesn't happen across SES groups. Lower income and people living in poverty do not engage with their kids. They do not talk to them, right? Do not do active play, right? But that's not a resource thing, right? It's not an expensive thing to just talk to your child and describe what's in the environment when you. So it's not a cash transfer that's going to change that, right? It's a kind of changing parenting attitudes. So this idea that the direct education channel is important is central to all this literature. Okay, so what's going to be the empirical strategy? I've kind of outlined, but let me just make sure we're all on the same page here. At any point in time, in this 14-year period, we have a particular cohort, born, let's say, people born in 1953. Some live in municipalities that implement the reform, and some live in municipalities that do not implement the reform. That's one contrast. The other contrast is that the next year, some municipalities that had not adopted before now are adopting. Right? So you can see for the same municipality, the cohort born in 1953 being treated, while the cohort born in 1952 not being treated. So you have that difference as well. So there's your double difference between municipalities and between cohorts. All right. Now this is a staggered implementation design, and the technical background for this is described in this paper, Callaway and Santana. We use simple diff and diffs in the results I'm going to show you, but in the appendix we've also implemented the Callaway and Santana approach, and the estimates are the same but less precise because, of course, they are more robust. Okay, so now it's a relatively complex design, and particularly when you go intergenerationally. So I need to explain exactly what the treatment is. Okay, for the parent generation, that's actually simple. The treatment is defined by somebody as somebody who who went to school or actually was born in a municipality that implemented the reform for them. Okay, that's the treatment for the parent generation. For the child generation, we have two alternative definitions. A treated person is one whose father was exposed to the reform. Okay, and then everything follows from there. Who he's going to marry, how he's going to live, and all that. You could then ask yourself, is there an alternative treatment? Yes. It could be that whether the mother was a treated person. But you can't just say mother and father, because that's endogenous. In other words, if I treat the father, increase their education, one of the things that changes is also their marriage market, right? Because they have now higher levels of education, right? So who they marry is a function of the reform, right? So we can't condition on that. And it's basically a very simple regression. You regress whatever outcome on a reform indicator, on basically, these are cohort dummies, or time dummies if you want to think of them like that, and these are municipality dummies. And then we also control for grandfather's education as well, right? So that absorbs some of the heterogeneity. And it's amazing. It's scary to think that actually this is quite highly correlated with the final outcomes. In other words, given all this, grandfather's education still explains grandchild's outcomes in many, many dimensions, and crime and earnings and everything. Right? So, sorry to say, you're really tied to your family here. Not completely. There are some escape routes, but they're still influential, and that's very interesting to see. So, in terms of inference, we are testing many hypotheses at the same time, and as you know, the false positive rate. If you're doing a hypothesis at the 5% level, on average, 1 in 20 hypotheses you will reject just at random, right? So you need to adjust for this multiple hypothesis testing, and we use the procedure by Romano and Wolf, 2005. It's called the step-down procedure, which basically allows you to define a family of hypotheses and an overall false positive rate for the whole family, right? So if you, for example, if you're doing 5 hypotheses, right, then the criterion for any one to be rejected, in other words, that you found an effect, is much, much stricter than if you're looking at only at one thing. Then again, you cannot drive that to the limit, because if you try and say, okay, I'm going to adjust for 100 hypotheses, then you'll have no power. So you try and have a balanced approach. I will try and justify it in a sec. So let's start with the father, and the father being treated. So this is child crime, and the right-hand side variable is whether the father was exposed to the reform. Okay, we have about 410,000 children here, right? And this says that the father being exposed to the reform reduces the crime rate of the child by about 0.8 percentage points, right? Now, if you think that the reform, just as an order of magnitude, if you think of the reform just increased father's education on average by about 0.17, let's say 0.2% over a year, this is not a small effect, right? You know, we're not saying, oh, we're going to put the father in for another 1 or 2 or 3 years, right? It's just a fifth of a year. And also reduces the percentage of multiple convictions by about 0.43 percentage points. These are the p-values. As you can see, these are really significant, right? And right, both for any conviction and multiple convictions. For daughters, it doesn't do anything, right? But the crime rate for daughters is very, very low in the first place, right? So this is the type of crimes. Now here we're using the Romano-Wolf step-down p-values. That means that each of these p-values takes into account that we're testing 6 hypotheses at the same time. So you can see that at the 10% level, violent crime goes down. At the 6% level, traffic crime goes down. And at the 5% level, all the other non-listed crimes go down. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to skip the mothers since there's not much there. This is just a robustness test. We write the different diffs result as an event study to show you that the impact is only at the time of the reform. Think of all the other points as placebo points. There's nothing there. So I'm going to skip the robustness since I only have 5 minutes. And I want to show you some of the results. Is that visible? Okay, so okay, let me try and do, I know this is not, I was hoping it was going to be a bit larger, but okay, so let me see what this does. So what did the reform do? It increased fathers and mothers' education. In this subsample, a little bit more, 0.32 over a year. It increased the education of his wife, right? In other words, he improves in the marriage market. What I'm trying to do here, I'm trying to show you that what the reform changed in the father that would justify what happened later on, right? So it increased his years of education. It improved his marriage market. It improved his earnings by about 0.8%, right? It improved his spouse's earnings. So basically what's going on here is that the reform improves all these outcomes for the father, right? So the father's outcomes improve in many, many dimensions. Earnings, education, who he marries, and so on. Okay, that's the first key channel. One other really interesting and important point is that the percentage of white-collar worker goes up by 1.2 percentage points. In other words, these guys are also getting better jobs, right? So you have a clear indication that the outcomes of the parent generation improved substantially in many, many dimensions as a result of the reform. Now, the other thing that it did, which is I found really fascinating, it improved the neighborhood in which the father lives. In what sense? In the sense that the child was born in a neighborhood of a lower crime rate and attended a school where the crime rate of their peers was lower. Okay, so that's an indication that the father's improved outcomes has actually leads to better child environments, right? So they grow up in a better neighborhood and they go to a better school in the sense of lower crime in that environment. Now, what happens to the kids? Other outcomes. Well, I'm focusing on sons here because that's where all the effects are. And I don't have the time to explain why we're not getting effects through the mother. But anyway, we have that I'm just going to mention the significant results. The employment rate of the children increases by 2.3 percentage points. The unemployment rate decreases by 1.9 percentage points. And that's not that significant on a multiple hypothesis testing, but on single it is. It reduces their welfare dependency. So, in other words, outcomes for the kids improve in more than one dimension. Now, oops, there's a bit of a randomness here again. Okay, so, okay, so now I'm going to finish with this mediation analysis. What we're doing here is the following. We're taking a bunch of outcomes for the father, right, and we're regressing them on the reform. All right, so these are going to be the causal impacts of the reform on, say, father's crime rate or father's schooling, right? Then we're going to regress the child's crime rate on the reform indicator, right, and on father schooling, mother schooling, crime, and income of the father, right? So in this regression, the reform is working either directly or through these mediators. The idea being that we'll be able to do a bit of an accounting exercise as to why we're getting improvements in the child outcomes, right? And in other words, is it because his schooling goes up, or is it because his crime rate goes down, right? You know, things like that. Or what is the unexplained part, right? So, yeah, so here we are. Okay, the direct effect, this is a slightly different subsample, a slightly different impact, but say not significantly different, just bigger. Direct effect, without any of the other mediators in, you get a 1 percentage point decline in crime. Then you include father's year of schooling. You can see that the direct effect declines to 0.4, right? And the impact through schooling is very large, right? So it says that that a lot of the reform is working through his own schooling. Now let's add mother schooling there. Okay, you're not getting a big effect on this simply because mother schooling, well, it was affected less by the reform. It was affected, but a bit less. Then we're going to add, let's go straight to the last column. We're going to add father's crime rate and household income. Now, you can't really see this. There is still a direct effect, but it's totally insignificant. And then you have a contribution from fathers and mothers schooling of about 0.9, a contribution of father's crime, and a contribution of log income. So, what does that mean? Ignoring what's significant and what's not, is this. This is basically the regression. The first number is the impact of mother's education on child's crime, say, there. Like in football, you're obviously not counting this. This is injury time. Okay, so the second coefficient is the impact of the reform on, say, father's education or mother's education, right? So you can do this accounting exercise where it says that we can explain, independently of whether it's significant or not, 54% of the total impact of the reform on child's crime, of which, of this 54%, about 45% comes because we improved his education. And because we're controlling for income, this is like the direct effect. This is the banker vis-a-vis the professor, is the same thing, right? Money does matter. It explains 13% of the effect. Only a small 13% of half the effect. So it's significant, actually, but it's not massive. Mother's education explains 21% of the effect. And father's crime, which we take to be a role model impact since we've controlled for income and for his education, explains 20% of the improvement in the next generation. Now, as I said, there is a 46% of an effect that's unexplained, but it's very precisely estimated and not significant. I'm not sure what one should make of that. So, now perhaps if in injury time I will just try and explain why. Okay, well, you'll have to read up on your own for this excellent, fantastic slide. Thanks very much for listening to me. I don't want to commit the crime of going over.
This was an excellent presentation. Colleagues, please just give Prof another round of applause. We were enthralled throughout the entire presentation. That is why you got the extra time and a third as well. Colleagues, we have time for only a couple of questions. I'm asking you, please, if you have some critical questions, ask them now, but keep your questions very, very short, please. Any questions?
because I think the channels are very, very fundamental, right? And in some sense, I would worry more if I was finding results like this in a low-income country, whether they would transfer to a wealthy country who has many, many support channels for kids and so on. And we find these kinds of effects in a country with very strong support for families and so on, right? I'm sure they would transfer to many different countries. The policy implications are very, very clear, I think. There has to be a very strong emphasis on human capital policies. And when I say human capital policies, I mean anything from birth with early childhood development programs of highest quality, all the way to high school with high quality schooling, because the cost justification of these policies is magnified dramatically if you take into account that it doesn't just improve the earnings of the affected generation, but improves many outcomes in the affected generation and many outcomes in the child generation. So this is a huge multiplier effect for these kinds of investments. It's kind of sad to see that many countries are not putting the emphasis on human capital policies as much as they should. And now, in this time of AI, it's going to become even more critical.
Just very specifically, you emphasized the importance of the grandfather's education transmitting down. You didn't say which grandfather, and I wonder if it matters.
But my colleague Morten Palme has actually written a paper linking all three generations.
Thank you.
To remove the inequalities in education, right, that were very kind of socioeconomic kind of driven, and to remove the and one of the sources of these inequalities was the tracking, because you had children from lower SES backgrounds would not pass, let's call it the 11 plus easily, and would end up with this kind of dead-end vocational type schooling. That was the atmosphere prevailing in the post-war era in many places, in the UK.
So
as I said, so now we're entering the realm of speculation. As I said before, I believe the channels here that we've identified are quite fundamental. And if you're asking, would they be true in say, Jamaica? Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure if you take account, like middle income country or higher income, and improve education to get a reaction both across many different outcomes and across generations.
All right, colleagues, we're going to take two more questions. We have one here and one at the back there. All right, three more and Linda at the front. But please make the questions quick and proper. We can make the answers short as well.
Hello, good morning. So I was looking at your model, and I'm assuming that you assumed that the the parent was exposed to the reform before they became a parent. I wanted to know, in the model or even in the ideation phase, did you consider the effect on the child welfare if, for example, the parent was exposed to the reform while they were a parent? So, for example, the father went to prison, he was exposed to the reform, and then he had a child, say 2-3 years. How would that, is that something that you considered? And if it was a factor that could be introduced into your model, how would that affect your findings?
Yeah, I don't think this is a major part of it. It's almost a non-existent part of the example. You have a very, very low teen motherhood or fatherhood. So no, we've not considered it, but there's not much data to consider it either.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I thought it was really interesting and I enjoyed it. I have a question, and it sort of ties into the whole external validity, because I was reflecting on our Caribbean experience. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, and we have done exactly this. We've expanded education, so from the post-independence period until now up to where tertiary education is completely free. But at the same time, we've been having, which everybody in this room would know, a horrendous problem with crime. Crime has been increasing. And I think some people here from Jamaica would argue sort of similar, because in the post-independence period, education also expanded, but crime went up. So my question is, just sort of reflecting on that, how would you tie that in with your model? And like, is it the assumptions not working? Is it the contextual factors? Maybe a little reflection on that.
Very good question. Other than that many factors will drive crime. One thing I would like to say about educational expansions, that the devil is in the detail, right? So it's not just about putting kids in rooms, it's about what you do with these kids, right? And the quality of education. There's this beautiful paper by Penny Goldberg, Norm Angrist, and a bunch of other people, published in Nature, a group of, they were all in the World Bank then, where they look at learning outcomes across many different countries. And in many of the low to middle income countries, they've been completely flat, totally flat, while at the same time education has been expanding massively, right? In other words, for example, the most striking bit is sub-Saharan and actually North Africa as well, right? You have a massive increase in the proportion of kids, say, completing primary school, for example, right? Which was a millennium goal, whatever. No improvement in learning outcomes, nothing, right? So you know, politicians have to understand that it's not about going to the homes, picking up the kids and putting them in a room which is called school that's going to improve things. You actually have to educate them. And that takes much more effort. It takes, you know, in other words, first of all, you have to basically increase the resources accordingly. You have to train teachers. You have to do, you know, proper systems of education. You have to worry about early childhood development because deficits build up long before the kids go to school, right? And then they become permanent, and then they translate to social inequalities over the life cycle, which are very, very hard to reverse.
Yeah, so as economists, we have to include all the costs, right? The opportunity costs. So I'm looking at that and I'm trying to figure out what, for Jamaica in particular, we would have had to maybe not pay off some of our debt, right? And Jamaica has this very, you know, they've reduced their debt to below the 100% of GDP. And so the question I have is, how do we compare the choice of Jamaica to reduce the debt versus to invest in education, and then does the return pay out? And this is a sequencing thing, right? Because we've chosen to pay off the debt first. And the education outcomes are pretty awful. So I guess, does the return outweigh that? That's the question I'm having, right?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps this is a bit above my pay grade, but you need stability. You need fiscal stability and political stability to invest in these kind of long-term projects. So if you're in, I'm Greek basically, so the mother of all financial crises was in Greece, right? If you can't do anything at that point, right? If you're sinking, if all the credit lines are closed, if your banking system is threatened with extinction, which it was, you're not going to do much. On the other hand, I think that fiscal stabilization, shouldn't take a decade, right? It should happen, and once the path has been defined to stability, then you should start thinking of the long-term investments. And there's very little long-term investments, better long-term investments than you can do than in education. And when I say education, I mean the entire learning system from birth, which might include, possibly nutritional education, but nutritional interventions, but also early learning interventions, and then primary school and so on. So we have to have a plan, a direction for that, and that has to be very, very clearly defined. And yeah.
All right. All right, thank you. Okay, I'm sure we can all agree that was a very interesting and fascinating presentation that has important consequences for us here in Jamaica. We know crime is a very serious problem, and all of us here are very passionate about education. So we have to think through the implications, quality of education, the income effect versus the human capital effect. And a point that really stood out for me that you made was the importance of talking to our children, right? So all the parents in the room, go home and make sure you spend some quality time talking to your children tonight, right? All right, so we're going to take our first break, 20 minutes. We're going to ask you to please take all your belongings with you because we're going to split the room into 2 rooms during the break. Before you go, I want to first of all acknowledge the presence of our Dean, Dr. Heather Ricketts. Thank you so much for being here and supporting us. And I also want to mention and thank some of our sponsors. You have Scotiabank, we have GK Capital, and we also have BOJ. So thank you very much for your continued support of WECON. So the break is going to be downstairs. The ushers are going to guide you to the food, which I'm sure you're very excited about. So 20 minutes. Take your belongings.